I was standing on my own front porch holding a heavy certified leather folder that contained a $5 million miracle. My attorney had just finalized the transfer from my late sister. She had left me a sprawling lake house and $2 million in liquid investments. I was practically floating up my driveway, ready to hand my only son the absolute financial security he had always dreamed of. But as I reached for the brass doorknob, I heard my daughter-in-law speaking through the cracked living room window. The absolute venom in her hushed voice paralyzed my hand in midair. She was telling my son that they could not afford to wait for nature to take its course, and that my existence was an active obstacle to their survival. Before I reveal the chilling details of the plot I overheard and the trap I subsequently set for them, let me know which state or country you are watching from down in the comments section. Hit the like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you believe that family greed always eventually destroys the greedy. Now let me tell you exactly how a life-changing financial blessing instantly transformed into the most ruthless wake-up call of my entire 71 years on this earth. The afternoon had started with such profound and overwhelming optimism. I had spent the last 45 minutes driving my 10-year-old trusty sedan back from the downtown offices of my attorney Warren. The air conditioning in the old car barely worked anymore, but I did not care. The windows were rolled down, letting the crisp autumn breeze wash over me. Resting on the passenger seat next to me was the thick manila folder Warren had handed me just an hour prior. Inside that folder were the notarized documents confirming the largest financial windfall my family had ever seen. My older sister had been incredibly frugal her entire life, never marrying and quietly amassing a fortune through brilliant early tech investments. Her passing had broken my heart, but her final gift was meant to mend the future. $2 million in cash and a gorgeous property right on the water. As a 71-year-old retired man living on a fixed pension, I had no need for luxury. My immediate and only thought was of my son Aaron. Since his mother passed away over a decade ago, Aaron was the only true family I had left. I loved him with a deep and unconditional, fierce loyalty that only a father can understand. I knew he and his wife Monica had been struggling lately with the rising costs of living. They had moved into my modest 3-bedroom home 6 months ago under the guise of helping me out around the house, but I knew the real reason was that they could not afford their rent. I had welcomed them with wide open arms, happy to have the noise and life back in the hallways. I pulled the sedan into the cracked concrete driveway and turned off the engine. The engine ticked softly as it cooled down in the fading afternoon sunlight. I grabbed the folder from the seat, feeling the physical weight of the paper inside. I smiled to myself, imagining the look of absolute shock and pure joy that would spread across Aaron's face when I placed the documents on the kitchen table. All of his worries would evaporate. They could buy their own home. They could start a college fund for the children they kept saying they wanted to have. I walked up the front walkway, stepping carefully over a loose paving stone I had been meaning to fix. The neighborhood was completely quiet, just the distant sound of a lawnmower humming blocks away. I climbed the 3 wooden steps to the front porch, pulling my house keys out of my pocket. I was in a state of absolute peace. I was a man bringing salvation to his only child. But the universe has a very cruel way of correcting our naive assumptions. The large bay window overlooking the porch was open just a couple of inches to let in the cool breeze. The sheer curtains were drawn, blocking the view into the living room, but the sound carried perfectly through the narrow gap. As my key touched the metal of the deadbolt, I heard Monica's voice. It was not her usual sweet public tone. It was a harsh, grating whisper dripping with raw contempt. I froze entirely. My hand stopped turning the key. My breathing halted. She was pacing furiously. I could hear the heavy thud of her heels striking the hardwood floor I had installed with my own 2 hands 30 years ago. "I am telling you, Aaron, we are completely out of time," she hissed loudly enough for the words to cut through the screen. "He is 71 years old and healthy as a horse. He could easily live another 15 years in this dump. We do not have 15 years. We do not even have 15 days. I stood there on the porch, The leather folder pressed tightly against my chest, feeling a cold and unnatural dread begin to pool in the pit of my stomach. Then I heard Aaron's voice. It was trembling, weak and thick with panic. It was the voice of a cornered animal. "I know, Monica, I know," he replied, his words stumbling over one another. "But what do you expect me to do? He is my father. I cannot just kick him out onto the street. He owns the house outright." Monica let out a sharp, cruel laugh that sounded like glass breaking. "Owns it," she mocked bitterly. "He is a retired relic sitting on $500,000 of equity while we are drowning in the guest bedroom. You need to stop being so pathetic and sentimental. Sentimentality is not going to stop those men from breaking your legs when they come to collect." The world around me seemed to stop spinning. The autumn breeze suddenly felt like ice against my skin. Those men. Breaking your legs. What on earth was my son involved in? I pressed my back against the brick siding of the house, making sure I was completely out of sight from the window. I closed my eyes and focused all my energy on simply listening. The father who had walked up those steps eager to give away his fortune was rapidly disappearing, replaced by a man realizing his home was occupied by hostile Thetiasil forces. Aaron let out a long, ragged sigh. "I should never have taken their money," he groaned, the despair evident in every syllable. "They promised the tips were guaranteed. They said the offshore accounts were untraceable." Monica stopped pacing. Her voice dropped lower, becoming dangerously calm and precise. "Well, you did take it, Aaron. And you lost it. Every single cent. And now they want their money back with interest. We are out of options. We are taking the equity out of this house, and we are doing it this week whether your precious father consents to it or not." I squeezed my eyes shut as the sickening reality of the situation washed over me in brutal, punishing waves. My only son, the boy I had coached in Little League, the boy I had worked double shifts to put through college, was severely compromised. I strained my ears, listening as Aaron began to confess the full, terrifying scope of his secret life. "It is $150,000. Monica," he whimpered, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. $150,000. I borrowed $50,000 to cover the initial margins on the offshore sports betting syndicate. I thought I had a system. I thought I could double it and pay off our credit cards before you ever found out. But the losses compounded. The syndicate is not a regular bank, Monica. They are a private, high-interest lending operation run by ruthless people. The weekly interest alone is bleeding my paycheck dry. If I miss the balloon payment at the end of this month, they are not going to send a collection letter. They are going to send people to find me." I leaned heavily against the cold brick, trying to steady my racing heart. $150,000 in illicit gambling debt to a dangerous syndicate. It was a catastrophic sum for a young couple. It was a motive for absolute desperation. I listened as Aaron began to sob quietly, the sound of a grown man utterly broken by his own foolish greed. "But this is his house," he cried softly. "How can we just take the equity? The bank requires his signature. They require a full psychological evaluation for a reverse mortgage at his age to ensure he is not being coerced. He is sharp, Monica. He reads every piece of mail. He balances his checkbook to the penny every Sunday. We cannot just slide a major real estate document in front of him and tell him it is a magazine subscription. He will instantly know what we are trying to do." I waited for Monica to show a shred of empathy or remorse for the horrific situation they had placed my home in. I waited for her to suggest they sit down with me, confess the truth, and beg for my help. I would have helped them. Even with the betrayal, I would have used a fraction of my new inheritance to save my son from physical harm. But empathy was not in Monica's vocabulary. Her response chilled me to the bone. "You let me worry about his sharp mind," she sneered, her voice devoid of any human warmth. "He is an old man, Aaron. Old men get confused. Old men lose their memory. Sometimes old men need to be placed in professional care for their own safety. And when they are declared legally incompetent, their power of attorney transfers to their closest living relative, which is you. My knuckles turned stark white as I gripped the folder. A new, horrific layer of their plot was unfolding right beneath my window. Aaron stopped crying. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion and a growing sense of horror. "I am talking about securing our future," Monica stated clinically. "It is actually very simple. Starting tomorrow morning, I am going to start preparing his coffee. I still have the heavy prescription tranquilizers my mother was given before she passed away. They are strong, Aaron. Very strong. I will start crushing a quarter pill into his morning mug. Nothing lethal, just enough to make him incredibly foggy. He will start slurring his words. He will stumble. He will forget where he put his keys. We will document it. I will subtly record videos of him looking completely disoriented and lost in his own kitchen. After a few days of this, we call the corrupt notary my cousin knows from the real estate office. We put the reverse mortgage application in front of him while he is heavily sedated. We guide his hand to sign the paper. If the bank questions anything, we petition the emergency court for full legal guardianship using the videos of his mental decline as ironclad proof. We get him committed to a state-run psychiatric facility where he will be heavily medicated and out of our way. The bank approves the mortgage. We pay off your gambling debt to the syndicate, and we keep the rest of the equity to finally start our real lives. He had a good run, Aaron. Now it is our turn. The sheer calculated evil of her plan hung in the quiet autumn air like a toxic cloud. They were not just planning to steal my home. They were planning to systematically destroy my mind, strip me of my human rights, and lock me away in a padded room to rot until the end of my days. And my son, my own flesh and blood, remained utterly silent. He did not scream at her. He did not defend me. His silence was the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. I did not burst through the front door. I did not yell or threaten them with the police. A profound, icy clarity washed over me, replacing the shock and the heartbreak. The loving father who had walked up the driveway was officially dead. The man standing on the porch now was a survivor. I carefully backed away from the window, making absolutely no noise. I tiptoed down the wooden steps, keeping to the edges to avoid making the boards creak. I walked all the way back to my sedan, gently opening the door and sliding into the driver's seat. I placed the $5 million inheritance folder carefully into the glove compartment, locking it securely. I gripped the steering wheel, staring blankly at my own front door. They thought I was a frail, confused old man waiting to be sheared like a sheep. They had absolutely no idea who they were truly dealing with, or the vast resources I now commanded. The war for my life had just begun, and I was going to let them think they were winning right up until the moment I destroyed them. I drove aimlessly for 20 minutes before pulling into the gravel parking lot of a 24-hour diner on the edge of the county line. I needed neutral ground. I needed a place where the air did not feel thick with betrayal. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth in the far back corner facing the door. The waitress poured a mug of black coffee, and I did not bother to ask for sugar. I opened my weathered leather briefcase and pulled out my heavy silver laptop. It was an older model, but it was entirely encrypted and incredibly fast. Aaron and Monica thought I was just a retired old man who spent his days watching daytime television and tending to tomato plants in the backyard. They had completely forgotten what I actually did for a living before the gray hair and the wrinkles set in. For 40 uninterrupted years, I worked as a senior forensic auditor for the Internal Revenue Service. The federal government paid me a very handsome salary to hunt down money that powerful people desperately wanted to keep hidden. I spent 4 decades dismantling complex offshore tax havens, tracking phantom shell corporations, and breaking down the financial fortresses of arrogant billionaires. I know how to find a single missing dollar in a maze of 10,000 bank accounts. My son and his wife were amateurs attempting to play a very dangerous game with a seasoned predator. I connected to the secure mobile hotspot on my phone and cracked my knuckles. The loving father who wanted to give them $5 million was gone. I was now actively clocking in for a new audit, and my own son was the primary target. I bypassed the standard search engines and logged directly into the state county clerk portal using my legacy access credentials. I did not need to break any laws or hack into secure bank servers. People vastly underestimate exactly how much of their financial ruin is permanently recorded in public records if you know exactly where to look for the digital breadcrumbs. I started by running a standard asset search on Aaron using his social security number, which I knew by heart. The screen populated instantly, and the sheer volume of the financial devastation made my chest tighten. They were not just struggling. They were drowning in a suffocating ocean of high-interest debt. I pulled up the Uniform Commercial Code filings. Aaron had taken out 4 separate payday loans in the last 60 days alone. Each loan carried an annual interest rate of over 400%. He had essentially set his own bank account on fire. I traced the property records for the luxury cars they drove. Monica always bragged to the neighbors about her brand-new imported SUV, claiming it was a bonus from her mid-level marketing job. The public lien records told a completely different and pathetic story. The vehicle was financed through a subprime lender at a predatory interest rate, and they were currently 2 months behind on the payments. A repossession order had already been quietly filed with the county court, just waiting to be executed by a tow truck driver. The deeper I dug into the databases, the uglier the truth became. I pulled their civil court records. Monica had 3 active judgments against her from credit card companies she had completely ignored for 2 years. Her wages were on the absolute verge of being legally garnished. I sat back in the booth and took a slow sip of the bitter coffee. The pieces of the puzzle were rapidly locking together. This was exactly why they needed my house. They were completely locked out of the traditional banking system. No legitimate financial institution would ever lend them a single dime with credit scores that looked like a crime scene. Their only escape hatch was stealing the massive equity sitting untouched in my home. And the offshore sports betting syndicate Aaron had cried about was clearly running out of patience. I shifted my focus to the $150,000 syndicate debt Aaron had whimpered about on the porch. Offshore sports betting operations are notoriously difficult to track, but they are not entirely invisible if you understand how international wire transfers function. I accessed a specialized public registry of foreign shell corporations operating out of the Caribbean. I cross-referenced those shell companies with Aaron domestic bank routing numbers, which I had access to from a joint checking account we opened when he was a teenager. The joint account was supposed to be closed years ago, but Aaron had carelessly left it active. I watched the digital trail of his profound stupidity unfold on my screen. He had been wiring thousands of dollars every Friday night to a holding company registered in Cyprus. The holding company was a known front for a violent domestic lending syndicate. Aaron was not just placing bad bets. He was funneling money directly to organized criminals, and he had completely drained his own savings to do it. The syndicate did not care about his apologies. They only cared about the return on their investment, and my son had just missed a massive balloon payment. I opened a new secure tab and began running property title searches on my own address just to ensure they had not already attempted a preliminary strike. My house was clean. The deed remained solely in my name. But then I ran a search on my late wife jewelry collection. When she passed away, she left a locked mahogany box filled with diamond rings and gold necklaces. I had kept that box hidden in the back of my bedroom closet, untouched for a decade. I cross-referenced Monica's name with local pawnshop registry databases, which are required by state law to report high-value transactions to prevent fencing stolen goods. My heart stopped beating for a fraction of a second. 3 weeks ago, Monica had walked into a pawn shop 2 towns over and sold my dead wife vintage diamond anniversary band for $4,000 in cash. She had stolen from a ghost to pay for her imported SUV. A cold, absolute fury settled over me. It was a terrifyingly calm anger. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They were planning to drug my coffee document my artificial decline and throw me into a state psychiatric ward to be forgotten. They were going to strip away my human dignity just to cover their own pathetic, catastrophic failures. I stared at the harsh blue light of the laptop screen, memorizing every single dollar amount, every single lien, and every single judgment. I now possessed their entire financial anatomy. I knew exactly where they were bleeding, and I knew exactly how to apply the maximum amount of pressure to make the bleeding fatal. I closed the laptop with a sharp, definitive click. The audit was complete. I had all the ammunition I required to absolutely destroy their lives. But destroying them directly was too simple, and it would not teach them the brutal lesson they so desperately needed to learn. I was not going to confront them. I was going to let them believe their horrific plan was working flawlessly. I was going to walk back into that house, smile at my daughter-in-law, and gladly drink the poison she offered me. I placed a $5 bill on the diner table, grabbed my briefcase, and walked out into the cool evening air. I was ready to go home and play the easiest role of my life. I was going to be the perfect, helpless victim. I parked the car in the driveway and took a long, deep breath to lower my heart rate. The time for anger had passed, and the time for a flawless performance had arrived. I stepped out of the vehicle and deliberately rounded my shoulders, letting my posture sag just a fraction of an inch. I dragged my feet slightly as I walked up the porch steps, making sure my shoes audibly scuffed the wood. When I opened the front door, the smell of roasted chicken and garlic filled the air. It was a domestic illusion crafted to lower my defenses. Aaron and Monica were sitting at the kitchen table. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like walking through deep water. As soon as the door clicked shut, Monica leaped up from her chair, wearing an overly bright plastic smile. She rushed over to take my coat, treating me like a fragile glass doll that might shatter at any moment. Aaron refused to look me in the eye. He kept his gaze firmly fixed on his plate, pushing a piece of chicken around with his fork. He looked physically sick, pale, and sweating slightly under the kitchen lights. He knew exactly what was about to happen, and his cowardice was nauseating. I played my part perfectly. I offered them a tired, confused smile and patted Monica on the arm, thanking her for cooking. I shuffled over to my usual chair at the head of the table and sat down heavily, letting out a long, weary sigh. I complained about my joints aching. I mentioned that I had forgotten where I parked my car at the grocery store earlier that afternoon, even though I had not been to the grocery store at all. The bait was set, and they swallowed it instantly. Monica and Aaron exchanged a rapid, triumphant glance. They thought the foundation of my mind was already crumbling naturally, making their job infinitely easier. We ate in relative silence. I chewed my food slowly, acting completely oblivious to the predatory energy radiating from across the table. When the plates were cleared, Monica announced she had baked a pie and made a fresh pot of decaffeinated coffee. I watched her walk to the counter. She turned her back to me to pour the mugs. My 40 years of forensic auditing had trained my eyes to catch micro-movements. I saw her left shoulder dip. I saw her hand hover over the dark blue mug that was always designated for me. I heard the faint, almost imperceptible scratch of a crushed pill being scraped from a piece of paper into the ceramic cup. She stirred it vigorously, far too vigorously for regular coffee. When she turned around, her smile was fixed, and her eyes were completely dead. She placed the dark blue mug directly in front of me. Steam rose from the dark liquid. I looked down at the coffee. Floating near the edge of the rim were 3 tiny chalky white specks of undissolved powder. The prescription tranquilizer. The poison meant to steal my life. A heavy silence descended on the kitchen. Aaron finally looked up, his eyes wide and terrified, watching the mug. Monica stood right beside my chair, hovering like a vulture, waiting for me to take the first sip. I knew I had to secure that liquid evidence, but I could not simply refuse to drink it. If I refused, they would try again tomorrow. I needed a sample, and I needed them to believe my physical decline was accelerating. I reached out for the mug with my right hand. I forced my fingers to tremble. Not a subtle shake, but a violent, uncontrollable tremor that started in my wrist and traveled up my forearm. I let my hand hover over the handle, acting as though I lacked the basic motor skills to grasp it properly. Monica leaned in closer, her breathing shallow. I finally hooked my index finger through the handle and began to lift the heavy ceramic. I brought it halfway to my mouth, then I intentionally completely relaxed my grip. The heavy mug slammed back down onto the edge of the saucer, tipping violently forward. The scalding, hot coffee cascaded across the wooden table, splashing onto my shirt and pooling rapidly toward the edge. I immediately let out a loud, startled gasp, acting utterly humiliated and terrified. I began apologizing profusely, babbling about how clumsy I had become and how my hands simply refused to work anymore. Aaron jumped back from the table as the liquid dripped onto the floor. Monica let out a sharp hiss of frustration, her carefully constructed facade cracking for just a split second before she remembered she had to play the concerned daughter-in-law. She spun around to grab a towel from the sink. That was my only window. I reached into my lap where I had kept a thick, folded cloth napkin hidden during dinner. I pressed the heavy linen directly into the deepest puddle of the spilled coffee in front of me, letting the thick fabric absorb as much of the drugged liquid as possible. It soaked through instantly. I swiftly shoved the damp, heavy napkin deep into the front pocket of my trousers, just as Monica turned back around with a roll of paper towels. I shrank back in my chair, raising my hands in a defensive, pathetic posture. I kept apologizing, my voice cracking intentionally. I told them I was so sorry for ruining the evening and that I just felt so incredibly tired and confused lately. Monica aggressively wiped up the remaining coffee, her jaw clenched tight, with suppressed rage that her perfect dose had been wasted. But when she looked up at me, cowering in my chair, her anger shifted into pure, malicious satisfaction. She patted my shoulder with a damp paper towel and told me in a sickly sweet voice not to worry at all. She said accidents happen to older people and that maybe I just needed a lot of extra rest. I nodded meekly, keeping my hand pressed against my pocket where the soaked napkin rested against my leg. I slowly stood up from the table, leaning heavily against the wooden frame of the chair for support. I told them I was going straight to bed, skipping the pie altogether. Aaron finally spoke, telling me good night, with a voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I dragged my feet all the way down the hallway. Once I was safely inside my bedroom, with the door securely locked, the helpless old man vanished instantly. I walked into the adjoining bathroom and turned on the bright vanity lights. I pulled the coffee-soaked napkin from my pocket. It smelled bitter, entirely unnatural. I carefully placed the damp fabric inside a clean plastic storage bag and sealed it tight. Tomorrow morning, Attorney Warren would have this delivered directly to an independent toxicology lab. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. There was no fear in my eyes. There was only a cold, mechanical determination to finish the job. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. I took the sealed plastic bag containing the coffee-soaked napkin and slipped it inside a padded mailing envelope. I walked 3 blocks down the street in the early dawn light and dropped it into a secure postal collection box addressed directly to Warren. The physical evidence was out of the house and safely on its way to the laboratory. When I returned, I ruffled my hair deeply, unbuttoned my pajama shirt unevenly, and shuffled into the kitchen. Aaron and Monica were already awake, drinking their coffee. I stumbled against the doorframe, intentionally hitting my shoulder hard enough to make a loud thud. I rubbed my eyes, acting completely bewildered, and asked them what time the evening news was coming on. It was barely 7 in the morning. The look of absolute predatory triumph that flashed across Monica's face made me want to physically strike her, but I maintained my confused, hollow stare. She gently guided me to a chair, speaking to me in the patronizing tone one might use for a toddler. She told me I had slept through the night, and that my mind was just a little foggy from old age. For the next 7 days, my own home became an active theater of psychological warfare. Whenever they were in the room, I became a pathetic shadow of the man I truly was. I deliberately misplaced my wallet, leaving it inside the refrigerator next to the milk. I would walk into the living room, stare blankly at the wall for 5 minutes, and then ask Aaron if his mother was coming home for dinner. His mother had been dead for 10 years. Every time I played these agonizing charades, I watched them exchange thrilled, knowing glances. They were absolutely convinced that the heavy tranquilizers were destroying my neurological pathways at an accelerated rate. But the moment they left the house for work or to run errands, the frail old man vanished. I moved with the speed and precision of a military tactician. On the second afternoon, while they were out at the grocery store, I drove to a specialized electronics shop in the city. I purchased 4 high-definition micro-cameras. They were the size of a coat button, equipped with motion sensors and encrypted wireless broadcasting capabilities. I returned home and spent 3 hours meticulously wiring my own house for surveillance. I installed the first camera inside the hollowed-out base of the smoke detector in the kitchen, giving me a perfect overhead view of the counter, where Monica prepared the coffee. I placed the second camera behind the thick spines of the encyclopedia set on the living room bookshelf, directly facing the sofa where they usually plotted. The third went into the hallway disguised as a decorative wall plug, and the final camera was mounted high in the corner of my own bedroom to ensure I was never compromised in my sleep. I routed the encrypted video feeds directly to a hidden partition on my laptop. I was no longer just listening through an open window. I was capturing their entire criminal conspiracy in high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. As the week progressed, I decided to escalate my performance to force them into making careless mistakes. I needed them to become so confident in my mental destruction that they would stop hiding their true intentions. On Thursday evening, I walked into the kitchen and turned on the gas burner on the stove. I did not light the flame. I just let the faint smell of gas begin to fill the room. I walked away and sat in my armchair, staring blankly at an unplugged television. When Monica walked into the kitchen 5 minutes later, she panicked and shut off the valve. She stormed into the living room and began screaming at me, calling me a dangerous liability and a senile old fool. I cowered in my chair, trembling and apologizing over and over again. While she yelled, Aaron stood in the doorway holding up his smartphone. He was recording the entire humiliating interaction. He was gathering his fake evidence for the emergency guardianship hearing, capturing footage of his confused, dangerous father nearly blowing up the house. He thought he was building an ironclad legal case. He had no idea the camera hidden in the bookshelf was simultaneously recording him recording me, proving exactly how staged and malicious their actions were. By the end of the week, their arrogance had completely blinded them. They stopped whispering. They stopped trying to hide their conversations. They assumed my brain was completely fried by the drugs they continued to slip into my coffee, which I secretly poured down the bathroom sink every single morning. I would sit in my armchair, pretending to nap with my eyes closed, while they sat just 10 feet away, openly discussing the reverse mortgage and the state psychiatric facility. I listened to Aaron complain about the massive daily interest accumulating on his syndicate debt. I listened to Monica promise him that they were only 48 hours away from locking me in a ward and draining my equity. Every night, I would lock my bedroom door, open my laptop, and review the surveillance footage from the day. It was a goldmine of felony offenses. I watched crystal-clear video of Monica crushing the prescription pills into a fine powder and stirring them into my morning mug. I watched Aaron pacing the living room, talking on speakerphone to his corrupt notary friend, confirming the dates they would force me to sign the fraudulent documents. I watched them laugh at my expense, mocking the way I stumbled and the way I cried when they yelled at me. They were giving me every single piece of ammunition I needed to ensure they would never see the outside of a prison cell again. They thought they were the predators stalking a weak and dying animal. They did not realize they had walked directly into a steel trap, and I was simply waiting for the perfect moment to snap it shut. The false decline was working perfectly, and the absolute devastation of their lives was now completely inevitable. It was early Tuesday afternoon when the burner phone hidden beneath my mattress vibrated silently. I had purchased the prepaid device specifically for communicating with my attorney to ensure my primary cell phone records remained entirely innocent. I locked my bedroom door and answered the call. Warren spoke with the grim, clinical tone of a medical professional delivering a terminal diagnosis. He had just received the expedited toxicology report from the independent laboratory. The coffee-soaked napkin contained massive concentrations of a heavy-duty psychiatric sedative. Warren explained the specific chemical breakdown. It was a potent benzodiazepine derivative typically reserved for severe acute psychiatric episodes in institutional settings. The dosage she had crushed into my mug was high enough to tranquilize a full-grown man into a state of semi-permanent compliance. It was not just a sleep aid. It was a chemical restraint designed to completely disable my central nervous system. If I had consumed that entire cup, I would have lost my ability to speak clearly, to walk without assistance, or to defend myself in any legal capacity. Warren offered to call the local police department immediately. He stated we had enough physical evidence to secure an arrest warrant for attempted poisoning and elder abuse. I told him no. I needed them to fully commit to the financial fraud. I needed them to execute the reverse mortgage and file the emergency guardianship petition with the court. An attempted poisoning charge could potentially be fought by a clever defense attorney, claiming it was an accidental mix-up of medication. I wanted them utterly destroyed with absolutely no possible legal defense. I instructed Warren to stand by and wait for my explicit signal to execute the massive financial counterstrike we had prepared. I ended the call and slid the phone back under the mattress. I took a slow, deep breath, ready to return to the living room and resume my act as the frail, confused old man. But before my hand even reached the brass doorknob, the door was violently shoved open from the outside. Aaron stood in the doorway, breathing heavily. His eyes were wide and frantic, darting around my bedroom like a cornered predator. Monica stood right behind him, her arms crossed tight over her chest, her face set in a cold mask of absolute authority. Aaron did not offer a greeting. He did not ask how I was feeling. He marched directly toward my bedside table and snatched my heavy leather keychain. The metallic jingle of the keys echoed loudly in the tense, oppressive silence of the room. I shrank back against the wall, deliberately widening my eyes in feigned terror. I asked him what he was doing, making my voice tremble and crack perfectly. Aaron gripped the keys tightly in his fist, his knuckles turning stark white. He looked down at me with a sickening mixture of disgust and fake pity. He told me that I was no longer fit to drive a vehicle. He stated that my behavior over the last week had become a massive liability and that he could not allow me to get behind the wheel of a 2-ton machine. He began reciting a long list of the fabricated mistakes I had made during my false decline. He brought up the unlit gas stove. He brought up my supposed memory lapses regarding his deceased mother. He falsely claimed a neighbor had seen me wandering the front yard looking completely disoriented. It was a carefully constructed lie to justify his aggressive escalation. I reached out a shaking hand, begging him to give the keys back. I told him I needed my car to visit the local pharmacy, to go to the bank, to simply leave the house and get fresh air. Monica stepped forward, inserting herself between me and my son. She looked me dead in the eye and stated flatly that I would not be going anywhere ever again. She said they were taking full legal and moral responsibility for my well-being, and that included keeping me safely confined indoors, where I could not hurt myself or anyone else. The terrifying reality of their escalation crashed over me. This was not just about taking away my driving privileges to keep me safe. They were completely severing my physical connection to the outside world. Without my car, I was effectively stranded in a quiet suburban neighborhood miles away from the city center. I could not simply walk to a police station or an attorney office without them noticing my immediate absence. They were establishing total physical control over my environment. Aaron shoved my keys deep into his pocket and turned his back on me. He coldly told me to stay in my room and rest. He stepped out into the hallway and pulled the door shut. A second later, I heard the sharp metallic click of the exterior deadbolt sliding into place. I stood completely still in the center of the locked room. I was now a literal prisoner in the house I had built and paid off decades ago. They thought they had entirely neutralized me. They thought stripping me of my mobility meant I was completely helpless to stop their fraudulent reverse mortgage scheme. They vastly underestimated the power of the digital infrastructure I had already set in place. My physical car keys were entirely irrelevant. The true weapon was the encrypted laptop sitting quietly on my desk. I did not need to physically leave the house to destroy them. I walked over to the bedroom window and looked out at the driveway. Aaron was walking toward my sedan, aggressively pressing the lock button on the key fob. He was claiming his first physical trophy of my assumed defeat. But his aggressive move had also given me the exact timeline I needed. They were accelerating their plot because the violent syndicate debt was coming due. The snare had officially closed around me, trapping me inside my own home, but I was the only one holding the trigger. I walked back to my desk and opened the laptop screen. The final phase of the forensic audit was about to begin, and my son was going to learn the devastating true cost of holding a retired government investigator hostage. I stood quietly by the bedroom window and watched the red taillights of my own sedan disappear at the end of the street. My son had taken my keys. He had locked my bedroom door from the outside. He had left me physically trapped in a house that I had paid for with decades of my own hard work. The metallic echo of the deadbolt sliding into place should have induced panic in an elderly man. It should have made me feel entirely helpless and abandoned. But as I turned away from the glass, I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I felt an absolute freezing calm wash over my entire body. The timeline had accelerated, and the phase for quietly gathering evidence had officially ended. The time for offensive action had arrived. I walked slowly back to my bed and reached deep underneath the heavy mattress. My fingers brushed against the cold plastic of the prepaid burner phone I had purchased and hidden there specifically for this exact scenario. I sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the blank screen for a brief moment. I was about to cross a threshold that would permanently alter the foundation of my family. I dialed the private direct line to my attorney, Warren. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and professional. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him exactly what had just transpired in the hallway. I told him about the violent confiscation of my keys and the lock on the door. Warren immediately raised his voice, demanding that we dispatch the local authorities to my address. He stated that we had more than enough legal cause for charges of false imprisonment and elder abuse right in that very second. I stopped him instantly. I told him that calling the police now would only result in a chaotic scene. It would put my son in a local holding cell for a few nights before he posted bail. I did not want a temporary inconvenience for them. I wanted absolute and permanent financial destruction. I told Warren to lower his voice and listen very closely to my next instructions, because we were going to execute a complex financial maneuver I had mapped out during my years as a forensic auditor. I explained the exact nature of the $150,000 debt my son owed. I told Warren about the offshore sports betting syndicate, the holding company in Cyprus, and the violent high-interest loans Aaron had taken to cover his gambling margins. I heard Warren let out a long, heavy sigh over the phone. He warned me that dealing with unauthorized lending syndicates was incredibly dangerous. He told me they were violent, unpredictable people who operated entirely outside the boundaries of the law, and that engaging with them could invite physical retaliation. I smiled in the quiet shadows of my locked room. I told Warren that money was the universal language of every single criminal enterprise on the entire planet. The syndicate did not actually want to hunt my son down and break his legs. Violence was messy, and it attracted law enforcement. Breaking his legs would not generate a return on their investment. They wanted their cash, and they wanted it quickly. I reminded Warren of the $5 million inheritance from my late sister. $2 million of that inheritance was sitting completely idle as highly liquid, untraceable cash in a secure trust account. I told Warren I did not want to pay off the debt to save my son. I wanted to purchase the debt entirely. I instructed Warren to immediately form an anonymous limited liability company registered in the state of Delaware. I wanted the corporate structure layered so deeply behind aggressive non-disclosure agreements and legal firewalls that absolutely no one could ever trace it back to my name. Once the shell company was established and funded, Warren was to use a trusted third-party corporate broker to contact the collection arm of the syndicate in Cyprus. The broker would make the syndicate a buyout offer they could not possibly refuse. We would offer to purchase the entirety of Aaron's outstanding debt portfolio for $175,000 in immediate unencumbered cash. It was a premium of $25,000 right over the top of the principal balance he owed them. From my 40 years at the Internal Revenue Service, I knew exactly how these underground financial networks operated. They were built entirely on high risk and massive default rates. An anonymous offer to immediately liquidate a toxic, high-risk domestic debt for a guaranteed instant cash premium would be accepted in a matter of hours. The syndicate would eagerly take the guaranteed profit and transfer all the legal and physical collection rights over to my anonymous holding company. Warren went completely silent for a long moment, processing the sheer scale and the ruthless nature of what I was asking him to execute. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with a mixture of professional awe and deep concern. He told me that if we successfully executed this corporate transaction, I would instantly become the primary creditor of my own child. I would hold all the terrifying power and leverage of the violent syndicate, but with the full weight of the American legal system standing firmly behind me. I told him that was precisely the objective. My son and his wife had decided to treat me like an obsolete financial asset, to be drugged and liquidated for their own survival. I was simply returning the favor by becoming the absolute master of their financial existence. I gave Warren my formal verbal authorization to wire the funds from my sister inheritance into the newly formed corporate account. I told him to authorize the broker and finalize the purchase before the sun went down that evening. Warren promised me the paperwork would be ironclad and the transfer of the debt would be entirely invisible to Aaron. I hung up the phone and slid it carefully back beneath the mattress, making sure it was completely hidden. I walked over to the armchair, sitting in the corner of my bedroom, and sat down. The entire dynamic of power in my house had just shifted with the speed of a falling guillotine, and my son was completely oblivious to the danger. He thought he had successfully neutralized a frail and confused old man by taking away a set of car keys and locking a wooden door. He had absolutely no idea that I had just purchased his entire life. When the sun set that evening, he would no longer owe his massive, suffocating debt to a faceless group of dangerous men operating out of a foreign haven. He would owe every single penny to the quiet old man sitting in the bedroom he had just locked. If he missed his next payment, I would not send violent thugs to his restaurant or threaten him in a dark alley. I would simply execute the aggressive default clauses buried deep within the fine print of his original loan agreement. I would legally seize his personal bank accounts. I would repossess the imported luxury cars parked in my driveway. I would garnish every single dollar of his future wages until he was completely destitute. I had become the invisible master holding his leash. He was now operating on borrowed time and my money. The snare had not just closed around him. It had locked permanently. He thought he was trapping me to steal my home, but he had just handed me the absolute legal authority to destroy his future. Now all I had to do was sit quietly in my room and wait for him to confidently walk into the kitchen with his corrupt notary. When he finally presented that fraudulent reverse mortgage document, the trap would snap shut, and the consequences would be absolutely devastating. The silence inside my locked bedroom felt heavy and absolute. I sat in the corner armchair for 3 solid hours, waiting for the inevitable arrival. I did not pace the floor. I did not show a single sign of anxiety. I simply stared at the wooden grain of the closed door, listening to the quiet hum of the central air conditioning. I was a hunter, sitting in a blind, waiting for the prey to confidently step into the clearing. At precisely 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy thud of the front door opening echoed through the hallway. I heard the muffled sound of low voices, followed immediately by the heavy, confident footsteps of multiple men walking across the hardwood floor. The brass deadbolt on my bedroom door clicked sharply. The door swung open to reveal Aaron standing in the threshold. He was not alone. Standing just behind his right shoulder was a man I had never seen before. He was a short, balding man wearing a severely wrinkled gray suit that smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cologne. He clutched a worn leather briefcase tightly to his chest, looking nervously up and down the hallway, as if expecting the police to jump out from behind the curtains. This was the corrupt notary. This was the man willing to risk a federal prison sentence and his state license for a desperate bribe. Aaron did not offer a greeting. He walked directly toward my armchair and grabbed me roughly by the upper arm. His grip was entirely devoid of any familial affection. His fingers dug painfully into my bicep as he hauled me up to my feet. I let out a sharp, startled gasp, deliberately letting my knees buckle slightly to simulate extreme physical weakness. Aaron cursed under his breath and practically dragged me out of the bedroom. I shuffled my feet awkwardly, whimpering softly, as he pulled me down the hallway and into the bright fluorescent light of the kitchen. Monica was already waiting for us. She stood perfectly straight beside the kitchen counter, her arms crossed tight over her chest. The kitchen table had been completely cleared of its usual centerpieces. In the dead center of the polished wood sat a thick stack of legal documents. Bright yellow sticky notes protruded from the bottom edges of the pages, indicating exactly where signatures were required. The stage was set for their ultimate betrayal. Aaron pushed me down into my wooden chair so hard my teeth rattled together. He stood over me, blocking my only exit. The sleazy notary scurried around the table and opened his leather briefcase, pulling out his official metal stamp and a heavy black pen. He refused to make eye contact with me, keeping his gaze firmly fixed on the papers. Aaron placed both of his hands flat on the table and leaned down until his face was only inches from mine. His breath was shallow and reeking of stale coffee and raw anxiety. He told me in a patronizing, sickly sweet voice that they were just taking care of some routine insurance paperwork. He claimed that the house needed to be properly appraised for structural damages and that the insurance company simply needed my signature to release the repair funds. It was an incredibly poorly constructed lie. Anyone with a basic understanding of real estate would instantly recognize the dense legal formatting of a residential reverse mortgage application. I decided to push them into a corner. I needed them to explicitly voice their threats, while the hidden camera tucked inside the smoke detector directly above our heads recorded every single syllable. I began to shake my head rapidly. I forced my breathing to become shallow and erratic. I looked wildly between Aaron and Monica, acting as though a sudden wave of paranoid panic had just washed over me. I stammered loudly, refusing to look at the papers. I told them I did not understand what insurance they were talking about. I said my house was perfectly fine and that I was not going to sign anything without my thick reading glasses. I pushed my chair back, letting the wooden legs scrape loudly against the tile floor. I told them I wanted to call Warren, my attorney, just to make sure everything was legal. The mention of an attorney shattered their fragile facade instantly. The notary visibly flinched and took a sudden step backward, clutching his stamp tight against his chest. Monica uncrossed her arms and slammed her palm flat against the kitchen counter. Her eyes flared with an absolute terrifying malice. She stepped forward, invading my personal space, and pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. She dropped the sweet daughter-in-law routine completely. She told me to shut my mouth and pick up the pen. She stated explicitly that there was no insurance company and there was no structural repair. She told me I was signing a reverse mortgage application right now because they were taking the equity out of the house to save their own lives. I looked up at Aaron, pretending to be completely devastated by this revelation. I begged him to stop her. I reminded him that this house was his childhood home. I pleaded with him, telling him that the equity was my only safety net for my old age, and that taking it would leave me completely destitute. I asked him how he could possibly steal from his own father. Aaron's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. The guilt and the cowardice inside him rapidly mutated into violent rage. He grabbed the front of my shirt, violently pulling me forward in the chair, until my chest pressed painfully against the edge of the table. He pointed toward the front window facing the street. His voice was a harsh, venomous hiss. He told me to look out the window. He said there was a white medical transport van, currently idling next to the fire hydrant 2 blocks away. He explained in brutal graphic detail exactly what that van was waiting for. He told me that if I refused to sign those papers, the men inside that van would walk through our front door. They would bring a heavy canvas straitjacket and a syringe filled with a chemical sedative. He explicitly stated that they had spent the entire week documenting my engineered mental collapse. He bragged about the videos they had secretly recorded of me wandering aimlessly and leaving the gas stove running. He said the judge at the emergency courthouse would not hesitate for a single second to grant him absolute total legal guardianship over my life before the sun even set. He leaned closer, his spit hitting my cheek as he delivered his final horrifying ultimatum. He told me that if I dropped that pen, I would spend the rest of my miserable, pathetic life locked inside a tiny padded room, eating pureed food through a plastic straw while strangers bathed me with a sponge. The absolute depravity of his threat hung heavily in the air. This was felony extortion. This was conspiracy to commit massive financial fraud, coupled with severe psychological elder abuse. The hidden camera in the ceiling was capturing a goldmine of irreversible criminal evidence. Every word out of his mouth was burying him beneath decades of federal prison time. I turned my head slowly and looked directly at the sweaty notary. I reached my trembling hand out toward him, pleading for basic human decency. I begged him to call the police. I told him he was witnessing a crime and that they were trying to steal my home and lock me away. The notary wiped a thick bead of sweat from his forehead, using the back of his gray sleeve. He looked nervously at Aaron, and then down at his shiny black shoes. He nervously cleared his throat and pushed the heavy black pen across the table until it rested right against my fingertips. He told me in a low, cowardly mumble that he was just a public official hired to verify a signature. He explicitly stated that he was not a social worker and he was not the police. He told me to just sign the damn paper so he could collect his fee and go home to his family. His complicity was now permanently documented. He had actively ignored a plea for help from an elderly man being physically threatened and financially extorted. I had pushed them exactly as far as I needed them to go. I had the complete, undeniable confession on encrypted video. I let my chest heave with exaggerated sobbing. I allowed real tears to well up in my eyes, drawing on the genuine, heartbreaking sorrow of watching the son I had raised transform into a ruthless criminal monster. I slumped my shoulders forward, completely simulating the broken posture of a man who had finally surrendered all hope. I let out a long, pathetic wail of defeat. I slowly reached out my violently shaking hand and picked up the heavy black pen. I held it awkwardly between my fingers, staring down at the thick stack of fraudulent documents that represented the complete destruction of my family. I was ready to sign their death warrant. The heavy black pen felt cold and entirely foreign against the skin of my fingers. I kept my head bowed low, letting my chin rest almost completely against my chest. I allowed a steady stream of genuine tears to fall freely, soaking into the frayed collar of my worn cotton shirt. I needed them to believe that my spirit had been entirely broken into a million irreparable pieces. Aaron leaned heavily over me, his shadow falling completely across the thick stack of fraudulent documents. He tapped his index finger aggressively against the bright yellow sticky note marking the final signature line on the bottom page. He told me to stop crying and just write my name so we could all finally move on with our lives. He spoke to me as if I were a stubborn child refusing to finish a plate of vegetables rather than an elderly man being actively robbed of his life savings. I took a ragged, shuddering breath and slowly moved my hand toward the paper, but I did not use my right hand. For my entire 71 years on this earth, I have been fiercely right-handed. Every single check I have ever written, every tax document I have ever audited, every birthday card I have ever sent to my son was signed with my dominant right hand. I carefully shifted my posture in the wooden chair, dropping my right shoulder down just a fraction of an inch and bringing my non-dominant left hand up to rest on the edge of the table. In the heightened, chaotic adrenaline of their own malicious greed, neither Aaron nor Monica noticed this subtle but absolutely critical shift in my physical mechanics. They were too focused on the yellow sticky note. They were entirely blinded by the desperate promise of the incoming cash that would save them from the violent syndicate. I gripped the thick barrel of the pen awkwardly between my left thumb and index finger. It felt incredibly unnatural and clumsy. My 40 years of forensic auditing experience had taught me exactly how large financial institutions process high-value reverse mortgage applications. A major corporate bank does not simply glance at a messy signature on a $500,000 loan document and automatically approve the transfer of funds. They run the documents through a rigorous automated and manual verification process. They compare the ink on the page against decades of established public records, state identification databases, and previous federal tax filings. They actively look for the exact pressure of the pen, the specific angle of the cursive loops, and the consistent flowing rhythm of the letters. If a signature looks coerced, hesitant, or fundamentally out of character, their internal fraud departments instantly flag the entire file, freezing the transaction. By using my left hand, I was not just making my signature look frail and elderly to sell my act. I was fundamentally altering the core biometric baseline of my own handwriting. I was engineering a physical signature that would instantly scream forgery to any competent bank underwriter sitting at a desk 50 miles away. I pressed the metal tip of the pen against the crisp white paper. I let my left hand shake violently, dragging the blue ink across the page in a jagged, pathetic scrawl. I slowly traced out the letter C. I made it look agonizingly laborious, as if every single tendon in my arm was fighting against the basic movement. Monica leaned in much closer, her breathing shallow and ragged with anticipation. I could smell her expensive perfume mixing with the sour scent of Aaron's sweat. She was practically vibrating with malicious joy, watching my supposed final defeat. I finished my first name, leaving a sloppy, uneven gap before starting the middle initial. This was the absolute most crucial moment of the entire trap. My legal government name, the name clearly printed on the original deed to the house, the name on my birth certificate, and every single piece of valid identification I own is Calvin Timothy. It has always been Timothy since the day I was born. I deliberately forced the pen downward and began to trace out a jagged, shaky capital T, but I did not stop there. I continued the agonizingly slow scrawl, deliberately spelling out the letters H-O-M-A-S, Calvin Thomas. I intentionally used the wrong middle name entirely right in front of their faces. It was a massive, glaring legal discrepancy hiding in plain sight. A residential reverse mortgage is a highly regulated federal financial product. It requires absolute total legal precision to execute properly. A mismatched middle name on a notarized deed transfer immediately nullifies the entire legal instrument from top to bottom. It renders the document completely useless for any financial purpose. It instantly transforms the paper from a binding federal contract into a piece of physical hard evidence proving intentional mortgage fraud. But I knew Aaron would not notice the error. I knew his profound arrogance and his suffocating panic would prevent him from actually reading the letters I was scratching onto the page. He only cared about seeing wet ink on the dotted line. He only cared about surviving the end of the month. I finally finished the last jagged letter of my last name and let the heavy pen slip from my awkward left hand. It clattered loudly against the wooden table, rolling off the edge and hitting the kitchen tile floor. I collapsed back against my chair, letting out a long, exhausted moan. I closed my eyes, acting completely drained of all physical and emotional energy. The exact moment the pen left my fingers, Aaron lunged forward like a starving animal. He practically threw himself across the table, snatching the top page of the application with a triumphant, terrifying bark of nervous laughter. He held the document up to the bright fluorescent kitchen lights, his eyes wide and manic with absolute relief. He did not read the name. He did not notice the incorrect letters. He only saw the messy blue ink and the blank space where the notary stamp was waiting to be applied. He turned violently to the sweaty man in the wrinkled gray suit and shoved the paper directly into his chest. He ordered the corrupt notary to stamp it immediately and get out of his house. The man scrambled to comply with pathetic eagerness. He did not ask me to verbally verify my identity. He did not ask to check my driver license or my passport. He completely ignored every single legal protocol required by his state license. He simply pressed his heavy metal seal into the bottom right corner of the fraudulent document, leaving a raised permanent impression in the white paper. He threw his tools back into his worn leather briefcase, snapped the cheap brass locks shut, and practically ran out of the kitchen. I heard the front door open and slam shut with a resounding thud. The coward had collected his dirty cash bribe and fled, leaving behind a legally useless document that would ultimately serve as his own written admission of federal guilt. Monica walked slowly around the table and wrapped her arms tightly around Aaron's neck, kissing his cheek loudly. They were openly celebrating their absolute victory right in front of me. They were acting as though they had just won a massive lottery jackpot. Aaron folded the worthless document carefully and slid it into a heavy plastic folder, holding it against his chest like a shield. He looked down at me, his expression completely devoid of any remaining human empathy or familial love. He told me in a cold, flat voice that I had finally done something useful for my family. He leaned down and explicitly stated that the medical transport van would be arriving in exactly 48 hours to take me away to the state psychiatric facility. He instructed me to stay locked inside my bedroom and wait quietly because my time in this house and my time as a free man was officially over. He grabbed Monica by the hand and they walked out of the kitchen, leaving me completely alone at the table. The sound of their victorious laughter echoed down the hallway, mocking me. I waited in the silence, listening intently, until I heard my bedroom door close heavily and the television turn on at a high volume. Then I slowly opened my eyes. The fake tears instantly dried up. The frail, trembling posture vanished entirely from my shoulders. I sat up perfectly straight in my chair, resting my right hand smoothly on the table. I looked directly up at the ceiling, where the tiny encrypted micro-camera was safely hidden inside the plastic shell of the smoke detector. The trap was absolutely perfect. The bait had been swallowed whole without a single second of hesitation. They were currently holding a worthless piece of forged paper, thinking it was their golden ticket to freedom and wealth. They were about to march confidently into a major bank and attempt to execute a massive federal fraud using a botched signature and a fake name. They had absolutely no idea they had just armed the very bomb that was going to permanently destroy their lives. The sharp metallic click of the deadbolt unlocking shattered the heavy silence of my bedroom. It had been barely 2 hours since the corrupt notary had fled our kitchen with that fraudulent piece of paper. The door swung open and Monica stepped inside. She was not holding a tray of food or a glass of water. She was holding a large cardboard box of heavy-duty industrial black plastic garbage bags. She dropped the heavy box onto the carpet with a dull thud. The sweet, patronizing smile she used in front of company was completely gone. Her face was set into a mask of pure, cold efficiency. She did not even bother to look at me sitting in the corner armchair. She walked directly to my closet and pulled open the double doors. I watched in absolute silence as my daughter-in-law began to systematically dismantle my entire life. She snapped the first black plastic bag open with a loud, violent crack that echoed off the bedroom walls. She reached into my closet and grabbed a handful of my button-down shirts, pulling them violently off their wooden hangers. She shoved them deep into the bottom of the trash bag without folding a single sleeve. She was not packing my belongings for a comfortable move. She was throwing away my existence as quickly and ruthlessly as possible. I let out a soft, pathetic whimper, leaning forward in my chair and clutching my hands together. I asked her what she was doing, trying to make my voice sound as weak and confused as possible. Monica did not stop working. She moved to the wooden dresser I had bought with my late wife over 40 years ago. She pulled the top drawer open entirely, lifting it off its metal tracks and dumping the entire contents directly into the gaping black plastic bag. Socks, undershirts, and sentimental trinkets tumbled out in a chaotic mess. She threw the empty wooden drawer onto the bed. She finally turned to look at me, her eyes narrowed with absolute contempt. She told me to stop whining and pay attention because she was only going to explain the schedule to me one time. She stated in a flat, emotionless tone that the bank required 48 hours to process and fund the reverse mortgage application. She said that meant they had 2 days to completely clear my presence out of the house before the appraisers and the contractors arrived to start knocking down walls. I reached out a trembling hand, begging her to leave my things alone. I pointed to a blue knitted cardigan resting near the edge of the bed. It was the last piece of clothing my wife had ever made for me before her hands became too weak from the illness. I pleaded with Monica, telling her it was precious to me. Monica picked up the soft blue cardigan and held it up to the light. She looked at it for a second and then dropped it directly into the trash bag, shoving it down with her foot. She told me I would not need heavy sweaters where I was going. She said the state psychiatric ward kept their building perfectly climate-controlled so the patients would not wander around. The reality of her terrifying timeline crashed down heavily in the room. She stood over me and delivered the final absolute ultimatum. She told me that a secure medical transport van was scheduled to pull into our driveway at exactly 9 o'clock on Thursday morning. That was exactly 48 hours away. She described the transport team in deliberate, horrifying detail. She said they were 2 very large men who specialized in dealing with uncooperative dementia patients. She warned me that if I tried to fight them, or if I started screaming for the neighbors, they were legally authorized to administer a heavy chemical sedative right there in the front yard. She told me it would be much easier for everyone if I just quietly got into the wheelchair and let them strap me in. I forced a fresh wave of tears to spill down my cheeks. I begged her to call Aaron. I told her I needed to speak to my son. I said Aaron would never allow strange men to take me away in a wheelchair. Monica let out a short, cruel laugh that sent a chill straight down my spine. She crossed her arms over her chest and looked down at me with absolute victorious pity. She told me Aaron was not coming to save me. She revealed that Aaron was currently at a luxury furniture showroom downtown. He was using a high-interest credit card to order a massive custom leather sectional sofa for the living room they were about to renovate using my stolen equity. She explicitly stated that Aaron had already signed the emergency guardianship petition and that he had zero intention of ever visiting me in the psychiatric ward. She told me my son considered me a burden that had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Every single word she spoke was designed to completely break my spirit, to make me surrender entirely to my fate. But as I sat there cowering in the armchair, crying softly into my hands, my mind was operating with crystal-clear, absolute precision. Up in the corner of the ceiling, hidden perfectly inside the plastic housing of the smoke detector, the tiny encrypted microcamera was recording every single second of her monstrous behavior. It was capturing the sound of her ripping my clothes off the hangers. It was capturing the exact moment she threatened me with forced chemical sedation. It was recording her full verbal admission of the emergency guardianship fraud and the reverse mortgage theft. She was voluntarily providing the federal prosecutors with enough high-definition audio and video evidence to lock her in a concrete cell for the rest of her natural life. Monica finished filling 3 massive black garbage bags with my personal belongings. She dragged them across the carpet and shoved them roughly out into the hallway. She left me with exactly 2 pairs of gray sweatpants and 2 plain white undershirts stacked carelessly on the edge of the bare mattress. She walked back to the bedroom door and rested her hand on the brass knob. She looked back at me one final time. She told me to enjoy my last 48 hours of freedom because once those men locked the doors of that transport van, my life as an independent human being was permanently over. She pulled the door shut and the deadbolt slammed into place with a terrifying metallic finality. I sat alone in the ruined bedroom, listening to her footsteps fade away down the hallway. I slowly lowered my hands from my face. The tears stopped instantly. My breathing steadied into a slow, calm rhythm. I looked over at the digital clock resting on the bedside table. The red numbers glowed brightly in the dim afternoon light. The countdown had officially begun. They believed the clock was ticking down to my absolute destruction. They thought Thursday morning would bring the transport van and their ultimate financial salvation. They had no idea that I had already purchased the violent syndicate debt that held their lives in a vice. They did not know the reverse mortgage application was a legally worthless forgery that would trigger a massive federal bank fraud investigation. The snare was fully set, and the 48-hour ultimatum was not my execution date. It was theirs. The sun rose on Wednesday morning, bringing a sickening atmosphere of celebration into my house. Aaron and Monica woke up early, but they did not get dressed for work. Through the encrypted audio feed of the hidden camera in the hallway, I heard them laughing loudly as they walked past my locked bedroom door. They were experiencing the intoxicating euphoria of unearned wealth. They truly believed that the forged reverse mortgage document was currently sitting on the desk of a senior bank underwriter, waiting to be automatically approved. They assumed that a massive wire transfer of $500,000 would hit their joint checking account before Friday afternoon. The oppressive fear of the violent syndicate debt had completely vanished from their voices, replaced by a toxic, blinding arrogance. They thought they had successfully outsmarted the system and outsmarted me. They unlocked my door just long enough to push a cold bowl of instant oatmeal onto my dresser before slamming it shut and locking it again. They did not even look at my face. I was no longer a threat to them. I was just an expiring piece of trash waiting for the medical transport van to haul me away. I sat at my desk and opened my encrypted laptop. I had spent 40 years auditing the financial habits of the criminally greedy, and I knew exactly what they were going to do next. When desperate people suddenly believe they have acquired a massive fortune, they never wait for the actual money to clear the bank. They immediately begin spending the illusion of that money. They construct a lavish lifestyle on a foundation of absolute vapor. I accessed the administrative dashboard of my home wireless router. Since I had installed the network myself, I could easily monitor every single website they visited on their smartphones in real time. I watched the digital logs populate on my screen as they sat on the living room sofa drinking my coffee and plotting their immediate future. The digital traffic revealed a breathtaking level of financial stupidity. They were not researching ways to cautiously pay off the syndicate. They were browsing the inventory of a high-end European auto dealership located 3 towns over. Monica was looking at a top-tier luxury sport utility vehicle. Aaron was configuring the options on a high-performance sports sedan. They spent 2 hours admiring leather interiors and premium sound systems, while the man who owned the house they were sitting in remained locked in a bedroom down the hall. Shortly before noon, I heard the front door open and close. I walked to the window and watched them get into their heavily financed imported car and drive away. They were heading straight to the dealership to claim their prizes. I returned to my laptop and pulled up their credit monitoring profiles using the legacy access I had established the day before. The auto dealership finance department operates on speed and aggression. I watched the live alerts trigger on my screen as the dealership ran hard credit inquiries on both Aaron and Monica. Their credit scores were absolute garbage, but auto dealers have access to predatory secondary lending markets that specialize in high-risk subprime loans. Aaron and Monica were sitting in a slick glass office showing the finance manager the fraudulent reverse mortgage paperwork. They were using my forged signature as collateral to prove they had a massive influx of cash pending. The predatory lender did not care about the pending status. They saw an opportunity to trap two desperate fools into loans with astronomical 28% interest rates. 2 hours later, the alerts on my screen confirmed the catastrophic reality. They had successfully financed over $160,000 in brand-new luxury vehicles. They had rolled the negative equity from their current overdue car directly into the new loans, creating a mountain of immediate toxic debt. They had signed binding federal contracts guaranteeing monthly payments they could not possibly afford without the stolen equity from my house. They were completely doubling down on a winning lottery ticket that had already been voided. I walked back to the bedroom window and waited. Around 4 in the afternoon, two shiny brand-new vehicles pulled into my driveway. Aaron stepped out of a sleek black sports sedan, gripping the leather steering wheel with a look of absolute triumph on his face. Monica climbed out of a massive white luxury utility vehicle, wearing a pair of designer sunglasses she must have purchased at the dealership boutique. They stood in the driveway, admiring the gleaming paint in the afternoon sun. They hugged each other tightly, celebrating their brilliant criminal mastermind plot. They looked like a wealthy, successful young couple ready to conquer the world. They were completely unaware, though, that they were actually two broke criminals standing in a driveway they did not own, celebrating a fortune that did not exist. The spending spree did not end with the vehicles. They returned to the living room and connected back to the home wireless network. I sat at my desk and watched the router logs light up again. The euphoria of the new cars had completely severed their connection to reality. They were no longer thinking about the violent syndicate or the massive balloon payment due at the end of the month. The syndicate debt had been invisibly purchased by me the previous evening, so the threatening phone calls from Cyprus had completely stopped. Aaron mistook this sudden silence for weakness, assuming the syndicate was giving him a grace period. This false sense of security fueled their next disastrous decision. I watched the digital data packets flow across my screen as they logged into a luxury travel agency website. They were not looking for a weekend getaway. They were browsing exclusive private island resorts in the Maldives. They spent an hour selecting an overwater bungalow with a private infinity pool and dedicated butler service. They proceeded to the checkout page. Since their credit cards were completely maxed out, they used a predatory online installment lender to finance the entire $25,000 vacation. They selected the non-refundable first-class airfare option to secure a minor discount. The transaction processed successfully. They had just chained themselves to another massive financial anchor. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow, quiet breath. The trap was no longer just a legal snare. It had become a financial black hole. In a single afternoon, they had accumulated nearly $200,000 in brand-new high-interest debt. They had signed non-refundable contracts and predatory lending agreements based entirely on the false promise of a ruined reverse mortgage application. They had built an absolute towering monument to their own greed. When the bank fraud department finally rejected that botched signature, the entire structure was going to collapse directly onto their heads. They thought they were digging a foundation for a beautiful new life, but I knew the truth. They had just spent the entire day happily digging their own financial grave, and they had made it so incredibly deep that they would never, ever climb out. I sat in the dim light of my bedroom, listening to the faint, muffled sounds of their celebration continuing in the kitchen. They were likely opening a bottle of expensive champagne they had picked up on the way home. The popping of the cork echoed softly through the drywall. Every laugh, every clink of a glass was another nail in their coffin. My 40 years at the Internal Revenue Service had taught me that the most dangerous weapon a criminal can possess is unearned confidence. It makes them sloppy. It makes them blind to the fatal errors hiding in their own paperwork. Aaron had not bothered to double-check the name I wrote on that application. He had not noticed that Calvin Thomas did not exist. His greed had completely overridden his basic survival instincts. He was a man falling from a very tall building, enjoying the wind in his hair and completely ignoring the concrete pavement rushing up to meet him. I simply had to wait for gravity to finish the job. The 48-hour window was closing rapidly, and the violent impact was going to be spectacular. It was Thursday morning, and the sun was shining brightly through the narrow gap in my bedroom curtains. This was the exact day my daughter-in-law had promised the medical transport van would arrive to take me away to a psychiatric ward. I sat quietly in my armchair, watching the live encrypted video feed from the kitchen on my laptop screen. Aaron and Monica were awake early, but they were not packing my remaining belongings or preparing for the transport team. They were standing by the kitchen island, drinking expensive espresso and discussing the private snorkeling tours they planned to book in the Maldives. They were practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. They knew that modern banking systems processed major wire transfers overnight, and they expected the $500,000 equity payout to hit their joint checking account at any moment. They were two arrogant fools standing directly beneath a massive suspended anvil, completely oblivious to the shadow it cast over them. The notification did not arrive through a slow paper letter in the mail. It came directly to Aaron's smartphone as a high-priority secure email from the regional branch manager of the bank. I watched the traffic spike on my router dashboard, and a second later I heard Aaron's custom ringtone echo sharply through the kitchen. He snatched the phone off the marble counter with a smug, victorious grin. He swiped the screen, expecting to see a digital confirmation of his newfound immense wealth. I leaned closer to my laptop monitor, watching his face in high definition. The transformation was absolutely spectacular to witness. The smug grin froze and then rapidly melted away. The color drained from his cheeks and his forehead so fast he looked as though he had just suffered a massive heart attack. His breathing stopped entirely. He lost his grip on the small ceramic espresso cup. It plummeted to the floor and shattered into dozens of jagged white pieces, splashing dark liquid across the tiles. Monica jumped back, cursing loudly, and demanded to know what was wrong. Aaron could not formulate a complete sentence. His jaw worked up and down, but no sound came out. He simply thrust the smartphone toward her with a violently trembling hand. Monica snatched the device and read the email aloud, her voice rising in pitch with every single terrifying syllable. The bank internal fraud division had officially flagged the reverse mortgage application. The underwriter cited severe biometric discrepancies in the primary signature, noting that the pen pressure and angle completely failed to match any of my historical public records. But the biometric failure was not the fatal blow. Monica read the next sentence, and her voice cracked into a shrill, hysterical shriek. The bank explicitly noted a catastrophic legal mismatch. The application was submitted for Calvin Timothy, but the signature clearly read Calvin Thomas. Because a reverse mortgage is a highly regulated federal financial instrument, the bank was legally required to halt the transaction immediately. They were not just denying the loan. They had permanently frozen the entire application and submitted a formal suspicious activity report to state financial regulators. The file was completely burned and red flagged. They could not simply print a new piece of paper and try again. Monica lowered the phone, her hands shaking just as violently as Aaron. She turned slowly to look at her husband. She asked him in a low, dangerous whisper how he could possibly be so unbelievably stupid. She demanded to know how he could physically stand over his own father, watch him sign a legally binding document, and fail to notice that the old man had written the wrong middle name. Aaron grabbed a fistful of his own hair, pulling at the roots, as he paced frantically around the kitchen island. The crushing reality of their spending spree was crashing down directly onto their heads. Only 24 hours ago, they had sat in a dealership finance office and signed binding federal contracts for over $160,000 in imported luxury vehicles. They had financed a $25,000 private island vacation using a predatory online installment lender. Every single one of those secondary lenders had approved their massive credit limits based on the fraudulent pending status of the reverse mortgage. Now the mortgage was dead, and the money was never coming. They were holding almost $200,000 in brand new immediate debt, and they did not have a single dime to their names. But the luxury cars and the vacation were only the beginning of their nightmare. I watched Aaron stop pacing and stare blankly at the calendar hanging on the refrigerator door. The bloodshot panic in his eyes widened into absolute sheer terror. He let out a choked, desperate sob. Today was the final day of the month. The massive balloon payment for his offshore sports betting syndicate was due by 5 o'clock that evening. He had been so utterly distracted by the smell of new leather interiors and the promise of an overwater bungalow that he had completely forgotten about the violent criminals he believed he still owed money to. The syndicate did not care about bank delays or fraud alerts. If the cash was not wired to Cyprus by the end of the business day, they were going to enforce the debt in person. Aaron lunged for his phone and wildly dialed the number for the corrupt notary. He put the device on speakerphone so Monica could hear. I listened through my laptop as the automated cellular voice stated that the number had been permanently disconnected. The sweaty man in the wrinkled gray suit had taken his desperate cash bribe and completely vanished. He knew better than to stick around when a federal bank fraud case was being flagged by the regulators. He had abandoned them entirely. Aaron threw his phone against the kitchen wall in a blind panic. The device cracked heavily against the drywall and fell to the floor, but Aaron did not even look at it. He collapsed to his knees right in the middle of the spilled espresso and the broken ceramic shards. Monica did not bend down to comfort her husband. The illusion of their wealthy power couple dynamic shattered instantly. She turned on him like a starving wolf backed into a corner. She called him a pathetic failure and a worthless coward. She screamed that her wages were going to be aggressively garnished, that the repo men were going to tow her brand new car from the driveway, and that violent syndicate thugs were going to show up at her front door. She ordered him to fix the problem immediately. She told him to unlock my bedroom door, drag me out to the car, and force me to walk into the federal bank branch in person to clear the fraud alert with my state identification. Aaron stayed on the floor sobbing into his hands. He shook his head violently. He told her it was completely impossible. He explained that if they dragged an elderly man into a corporate bank branch under obvious distress, the security guards and the tellers would immediately separate us. They would take me into a private office and ask me questions alone. If I told the bank managers about the heavy sedatives in my coffee, about the deadbolt locked on the outside of my bedroom door, and about the medical transport van they had threatened me with, the bank would lock the doors and call the police. Aaron knew they would both be leaving the bank in handcuffs. The trap I had carefully engineered was utterly flawless. They desperately needed me to authorize the massive transfer of wealth, but they had abused me and terrorized me so severely that they could not possibly risk putting me in front of any legitimate authority figure. They were completely paralyzed by their own horrific actions. I sat in my quiet bedroom watching their entire world burn to the ground. The 48-hour ultimatum they had given me was dissolving into useless dust. The medical transport van was never going to arrive because they no longer had the funds to pay the private contractors. Their entire criminal enterprise had been completely neutralized and destroyed by a single deliberately misspelled name written awkwardly with my left hand. Aaron crawled over to the base of the kitchen cabinets, pulling his knees up to his chest like a frightened child. He told Monica that they needed to pack their bags and run away before the sun went down. He believed the syndicate collection agents were already actively hunting him. He had absolutely no idea that the dangerous syndicate was entirely out of the picture. He did not know that the true owner of his massive life-threatening debt was sitting just 30 feet down the hallway, listening to every single pathetic whimper. The hammer had officially fallen. The false victory was over, and the final devastating phase of their punishment was about to commence. I watched the pathetic display on the kitchen floor through my laptop monitor. Aaron remained curled against the baseboards, while Monica paced the room like a caged animal. The digital clock on the screen flashed 1 in the afternoon. They had exactly 4 hours until they believed the offshore syndicate would authorize a violent collection. The absolute terror of physical harm was finally overriding the shock of the rejected bank loan. Monica stopped pacing and stood over her husband. She kicked the sole of his shoe hard enough to make him flinch. She told him crying was not going to pay the debt. She said the forged reverse mortgage was a dead end, but the house was still sitting on $500,000 of pure equity. She commanded him to open his laptop and execute the final contingency plan they had discussed earlier in the week. Aaron wiped his face with the back of his trembling hand and pulled himself up from the floor. He retrieved his silver computer from the dining table and opened it with frantic, jerky movements. I leaned forward in my armchair, keeping my eyes locked on my own monitor. I tracked his digital movements through the rotor gateway. He was not looking for another predatory loan. He was logging directly into the expedited electronic filing system for the county family court. He was initiating a formal petition for emergency ex parte guardianship. It is a severe legal mechanism designed to strip an individual of their basic human rights within hours if they are deemed an immediate physical threat to themselves or others. Through the encrypted camera feed, I watched Aaron compile the digital evidence for his fraudulent petition. He opened the video files he had secretly recorded on his smartphone over the past 7 days. He used a basic editing program to ruthlessly cut the footage down to the most damning segments. He clipped the video of the kitchen gas stove incident, completely removing the part where Monica had intentionally left the room and screamed at me. He left only the few seconds where I stood looking blankly at the unlit burner. He edited the footage of the spilled coffee, making it look like a severe neurological failure rather than an accident caused by his wife attempting to drug me. He stitched together a horrifying compilation of a frail old man who appeared completely unmoored from reality. He attached the manipulated video file to the digital court submission. Then he began to type out a sworn affidavit under the strict penalty of perjury. He wrote a completely fabricated narrative claiming I had violently deteriorated over the last 48 hours. He stated that I was refusing to eat, that I was wandering the house at night, looking for my deceased wife, and that I had become dangerously aggressive toward him and Monica. He explicitly requested that the judge grant him immediate and total control over my medical decisions, my physical residence, and my financial estate. He wrote that they had a cash buyer ready to purchase the property immediately to fund my long-term institutional care. It was a masterpiece of absolute legal fiction, driven entirely by suffocating panic. He clicked the final submission button and paid the expedited filing fee using a credit card that was already pushed to its absolute limit. The petition was officially in the hands of the county judicial system. In cases involving alleged severe elder dementia and the threat of an immediate gas explosion, judges do not wait for a thorough psychological evaluation. They act immediately to secure the safety of the individual and the surrounding neighborhood. Aaron and Monica were banking on this exact judicial panic. They believed the judge would rubber stamp the emergency order and grant them the legal authority to sell my house out from under me before the sun went down. I sat back in my armchair and took a slow, measured breath. The trap had now completely moved out of my private home and into the public legal arena. This was the exact scenario I had meticulously engineered. By filing a sworn affidavit filled with verifiable lies and submitting manipulated video evidence to a sitting county judge, Aaron had just committed multiple counts of severe federal and state perjury. He had documented his own extortion plot on the official public record. I reached under my mattress and retrieved the prepaid burner phone. I dialed my attorney, Warren, and told him to monitor the county docket system for my name. I instructed him to prepare the original, unedited, high-definition surveillance footage, the toxicology report from the coffee napkin, and the certified inheritance documents. I told him the emergency hearing would likely be scheduled within the next 2 hours, and that he needed to be waiting for me in the courthouse lobby. I ended the call and placed the phone back under the mattress. I smoothed the wrinkles out of my gray sweatpants and waited for my son to come unlock my door. He was about to drag me into a courtroom to steal my life, but he was actually walking us directly to his own execution. I did not have to wait long. Less than an hour after Aaron submitted his fraudulent petition, the heavy deadbolt on my bedroom door snapped back with a sharp metallic crack. The door was violently shoved open. Aaron and Monica stood in the threshold, dressed in conservative dark clothing, attempting to look like respectable, concerned citizens. Their faces were flushed with a sick, manic energy. Aaron marched directly into the room and grabbed me by the collar of my shirt. He pulled me up from the armchair with enough force to make my shoulder pop. He did not bother to explain where we were going. He simply told me that my reign of terror was over and that a judge was waiting to finally lock me away. I let my legs wobble and collapse slightly, leaning all of my weight heavily against him. I let out a pathetic string of apologies, begging him to let me stay in my room. Monica grabbed my old winter coat from the closet and threw it roughly over my shoulders. She told me to stop crying and walk because they were not going to be late for their own salvation. Aaron kept a tight, bruising grip on my right bicep, practically dragging me down the hallway. I dragged my feet across the hardwood floors, making a desperate show of resistance. Every time I stumbled, Aaron would yank my arm violently, cursing under his breath. He was treating his own father like a captured animal being led to the slaughter. We reached the front door, and Monica shoved me out onto the porch. The bright afternoon sun stung my eyes. Parked in the driveway was the brand new imported black sports sedan Aaron had financed just 24 hours ago. It was a massive monument to his towering financial stupidity. Aaron opened the heavy rear door and shoved me roughly into the back seat. I fell awkwardly against the stiff new leather, hitting my knee hard against the center console. I curled my body into a tight ball, pulling my knees up to my chest and hiding my face in my trembling hands. Aaron slammed the door shut, trapping me inside. The smell of the new car interior was suffocatingly strong. Aaron and Monica climbed into the front seats. I watched them through the gaps in my fingers. They were completely giddy. Monica reached across the center console and grabbed Aaron by the hand, squeezing it tightly. She looked at him with pure admiration, praising him for taking aggressive control of their destiny. She adjusted the rearview mirror so she could look directly at me cowering in the back. She smiled a terrible, venomous smile. She told me to take a good, long look out the window, because this was the absolute last time I would ever see the outside world without heavy medical supervision. She explicitly promised me that by sunset I would be wearing a paper gown and sleeping on a plastic mattress in a locked psychiatric ward. She said the house would finally be entirely theirs to do with as they pleased. Aaron laughed a hollow, cruel sound and accelerated aggressively out of the neighborhood. They were high on the adrenaline of their own perceived victory. They honestly believed they had completely defeated me and that their massive syndicate debt was about to vanish. The drive to the county courthouse took 20 agonizing minutes. Aaron navigated the city traffic with reckless aggression, desperately eager to seal my fate. He parked the expensive luxury sedan illegally in a commercial loading zone right in front of the main judicial building. He did not care about a parking ticket because he genuinely believed he was only minutes away from securing $500,000 of my stolen equity. He opened my door and dragged me out of the back seat. He kept a vice-like grip on my arm as we walked up the wide concrete steps. The towering stone pillars of the courthouse cast a long, dark shadow over us. We passed through the security metal detectors in the lobby. Aaron shoved me forward toward the heavy wooden doors of the family court division. He leaned down and whispered harshly in my ear, telling me to keep my mouth completely shut in front of the judge unless I wanted the medical orderlies to use heavy physical restraints. He pushed open the heavy double doors and marched me into the bright courtroom. He smirked, believing he was walking a helpless victim right to the executioner block. He had absolutely no idea that my attorney, Warren, was already sitting quietly in the back row, holding a leather briefcase full of pure, undeniable destruction. The heavy oak doors of the family court division swung shut behind us, sealing us inside a massive room that smelled of polished wood and harsh floor wax. The courtroom was intimidating by design. A high vaulted ceiling echoed every footstep, and the imposing wooden bench at the front of the room loomed over us like a fortress. Aaron pushed me roughly into a hard wooden chair at the respondent table. He and Monica immediately hurried over to the petitioner table, sitting down and arranging their fabricated documents with aggressive urgency. I slumped my shoulders forward, keeping my head bowed low, playing the role of the broken, confused old man to absolute perfection. I did not look at them. I kept my eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor, listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioning. A sudden, sharp voice ordered us to rise. A side door opened, and Judge Bennett walked up to the bench. She was an older, stern-looking woman with silver hair pulled back into a tight bun. She adjusted her thick reading glasses and looked down at the docket file resting in front of her. She sighed heavily, resting her chin in her hands. Emergency ex parte guardianship hearings are notoriously difficult and emotionally draining for everyone involved. The judge looked across the room at me, sitting hunched and trembling in my oversized winter coat. Her eyes softened with genuine pity. She saw exactly what Aaron wanted her to see. She saw a tragic burden. The judge formally opened the hearing and asked Aaron to take the witness stand to present his petition. Aaron stood up, smoothing his conservative dark suit. He walked confidently to the wooden witness box and placed his hand on the Bible, swearing under oath to tell the complete truth. He sat down and adjusted the microphone. The performance he delivered over the next 15 minutes was nothing short of a theatrical masterpiece. He began by letting his voice crack perfectly on the very first syllable. He told the judge that he loved his father more than anything in the world, and that this was the most agonizing day of his entire life. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a white handkerchief, dabbing at the corners of his dry eyes. Aaron recounted the completely fabricated timeline of my rapid mental decline. He spoke in a hushed, devastated tone, describing how I had supposedly forgotten the name of his late mother. He painted a terrifying picture of the kitchen incident, claiming I had intentionally turned on the gas stove and stood there waiting for the house to fill with toxic fumes. He lied effortlessly under the strict penalty of perjury. He told the judge that he had not slept in over a week because he had to stay awake and guard my bedroom door to ensure I did not wander out into the street and get hit by a passing car. He elaborated on the danger, claiming the neighbors were absolutely terrified of my erratic behavior and had threatened to call the authorities on multiple occasions. He claimed I had become violently aggressive toward Monica, throwing plates and screaming obscenities at her when she tried to feed me. Monica played her supporting role flawlessly from the petitioner table. Every time Aaron mentioned a supposed act of aggression, she would lower her head and quietly sob into a tissue, acting like a traumatized victim of my non-existent abuse. Aaron turned to look directly at the judge, his hands clasped together in a posture of desperate prayer. He explicitly stated that my house was an absolute hazard and that my liquid assets needed to be immediately seized and managed by him to afford the specialized institutional care I so desperately required. He told the judge that he had a medical transport van on standby waiting for her signature so they could safely remove me from the home before I killed myself or someone else. Judge Bennett listened to every single word with rapt attention. She nodded sympathetically, taking detailed notes on her legal pad. She did not interrupt him once. When Aaron finally finished his tearful monologue, the courtroom was completely silent. The judge looked down at the manipulated video files Aaron had submitted into evidence, playing them quietly on her monitor. I watched the reflection of the screen in her thick glasses. She was watching the heavily edited footage of me looking lost and confused. The trap Aaron had built seemed entirely inescapable. The judge let out a long, heavy sigh and turned her gaze toward me. Her expression was no longer just pity. It was the absolute clinical resolve of a magistrate who had made up her mind. She believed every single lie my son had just sworn to on the Holy Bible. She leaned forward toward her microphone and asked me if I had legal representation or if I even understood why I was sitting in her courtroom today. The entire room waited for my pathetic, confused response. They thought the hearing was practically over. They did not know the trial had not even truly begun. The heavy silence in the courtroom stretched out for a long, agonizing moment after the judge asked me if I understood why I was there. Aaron turned slightly in his chair at the petitioner table. I could see the faint outline of a victorious smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Monica reached under the heavy wooden table and rested her hand on his knee, giving it a reassuring squeeze. They thought the final nail had just been hammered into my coffin. Judge Bennett leaned closer to her microphone, her silver-framed glasses catching the fluorescent overhead lights. She spoke to me in that slow, deliberate tone people reserve for lost children and the profoundly deaf. She asked me again if I knew my own name and if I needed her to appoint a state advocate to help me comprehend the proceedings. She was offering me a lifeline built entirely on the false premise of my own mental incompetence. I kept my head bowed for exactly 3 more seconds. Then the grand performance officially ended. I slowly unclasped my violently shaking hands, resting them perfectly flat and completely steady against the polished wood of the respondent table. I did not struggle to stand. I pushed my chair back with a smooth, deliberate motion and rose to my feet. The hunched, frail curve of my spine vanished instantly. I rolled my shoulders back, expanding my chest and drawing myself up to my full height. I took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with the stale courtroom air. I reached up and pulled the heavy, oversized winter coat off my shoulders, folding it neatly and placing it over the back of my chair. Underneath the coat, I was not wearing the wrinkled pajamas of a dementia patient. I was wearing a sharply tailored navy blue suit, the exact suit I used to wear when I deposed hostile corporate witnesses for the federal government. The physical transformation was absolute and immediate. I was no longer a trembling old man begging for mercy. I was a senior forensic investigator standing on my own battlefield. Aaron's smirk instantly evaporated. He physically recoiled in his wooden chair, his eyes going wide with a sudden, terrifying confusion. Monica dropped her tissue, her jaw falling slack as she stared at the man she had brutally packed into garbage bags just 24 hours ago. Judge Bennett froze her pen, hovering an inch above her legal pad. Her brow furrowed in deep surprise as she watched my posture shift from a crumbling ruin to a pillar of absolute stone. I looked directly up at the bench, meeting the judge's gaze with eyes that were completely clear, cold, and terrifyingly sharp. When I finally spoke, my voice did not crack. It did not tremble or whisper. It rang out across the cavernous courtroom with the deep, resonant authority of a man completely in control of his own destiny. I stated my full legal name, Calvin Timothy, clearly emphasizing the middle name that Aaron had failed to notice on his forged documents. I told the judge that I was entirely aware of the proceedings and that I was completely competent to participate in my own defense against the malicious perjury that had just been committed in her courtroom. Before the judge could even begin to process the stunning reversal unfolding in front of her, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud, definitive crash. Every head in the room turned toward the noise. Striding down the center aisle with the absolute confidence of an apex predator was my attorney, Warren. He was dressed in a flawless charcoal gray suit. He did not look like a man rushing to an emergency hearing. He looked like an executioner arriving exactly on schedule. In each hand he carried a thick, reinforced leather briefcase bulging with the catastrophic physical and digital evidence we had spent the last week meticulously compiling. He did not even glance at Aaron or Monica as he walked past their table. He treated them as if they were entirely invisible, as if they were already ghosts haunting a prison cell. Warren reached the respondent table and stood firmly by my side, placing the heavy briefcases onto the polished wood with a resounding thud. He unlatched the brass locks with a sharp click. I turned my attention back to the stunned judge. I formally introduced Warren as my retained legal counsel. I stated in a clinical, even tone that my son had just sworn under oath to a completely fabricated narrative designed to facilitate a massive financial extortion plot. I told the judge that we were not requesting a delay or a psychiatric evaluation. We were requesting her immediate attention because we were about to enter irrefutable high-definition evidence proving multiple felony counts of elder abuse, attempted poisoning, and federal bank fraud. Aaron let out a strangled, pathetic gasp from the petitioner table, finally understanding that he had not trapped a helpless victim. He had locked himself inside a cage with a monster, and I was about to completely tear his life apart. Warren did not wait for the judge to ask him for his credentials. He unlatched the heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a sleek silver laptop and a small encrypted external hard drive. He approached the bailiff and requested permission to connect directly to the courtroom display monitors. Judge Bennett granted the request, her eyes darting nervously between my sudden transformation and the terrified faces of my son and daughter-in-law. Aaron tried to stand up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He stammered, opening his mouth to speak, but the judge slammed her wooden gavel down so hard the sound echoed like a gunshot. She ordered him to sit down and remain completely silent, warning him that he was walking a razor-thin line concerning severe perjury charges. Warren connected the cables, and the two large flat-screen monitors mounted on the courtroom walls flickered to life. He did not start with an opening statement. He let the raw, high-definition evidence speak entirely for itself. He clicked the first file. The screen displayed a crystal-clear overhead angle of my own kitchen. The timestamp in the bottom corner indicated it was recorded exactly 1 week ago. The courtroom speakers crackled slightly before broadcasting the crisp audio of my home. The judge leaned forward, adjusting her glasses. On the screen, Monica was standing at the kitchen counter. Her back was initially turned, but then she pivoted to grab a mug. The video showed Monica explicitly pulling a small orange prescription bottle from her purse. The high-definition lens of the hidden microcamera captured every single detail. The courtroom watched in absolute dead silence as my daughter-in-law tapped 3 white pills onto the marble counter. They watched her take the back of a heavy metal spoon and crush the pills into a fine, chalky powder. They watched her scrape that powder directly into my dark blue coffee mug and stir it violently. Warren paused the video exactly on Monica's face as she turned around to serve me the coffee. Her expression on the screen was not that of a concerned caregiver. It was a mask of cold, calculated malice. Warren reached into his briefcase and produced a thick stack of certified medical documents. He handed the first copy to the bailiff to pass to the judge. He stated in a loud, clear voice that the documents contained an expedited toxicology report from an independent state-licensed laboratory. He explained that I had successfully secured a sample of that exact coffee using a cloth napkin. He read the chemical breakdown aloud, identifying the potent psychiatric sedative Monica had deployed. He looked directly at Monica and stated that the dosage she had administered was legally classified as a chemical restraint and constituted severe felony elder abuse and attempted poisoning. Monica let out a high-pitched, panicked noise. She shook her head wildly, looking at Aaron for help, but Aaron was staring at the floor, completely paralyzed by fear. The judge looked down at the toxicology report and then back up at the frozen image of Monica on the screen. The sympathy Judge Bennett had shown just 10 minutes ago evaporated entirely. Her face hardened into a mask of pure judicial wrath. She asked Monica if she had a medical license to administer psychiatric sedatives to an elderly man. Monica could not answer. She just continued to shake her head, her carefully constructed facade crumbling into dust. Warren did not give them a single second to breathe. He clicked the next video file. The monitors shifted to a different angle, showing the kitchen table. This was the footage of the crooked notary ambush. The audio was flawless. The entire courtroom heard Aaron's aggressive, heavy footsteps. They heard the terrifying sound of his voice echoing through the speakers as he grabbed me by the shirt and threatened to lock me away in a padded room. Every single vicious lie he had just told the judge under oath was systematically dismantled by his own recorded voice. The judge heard Aaron explicitly outline his plan to steal my house equity to cover his own debts. She heard him threaten me with the medical transport van and forced chemical sedation if I did not sign the reverse mortgage application. Judge Bennett's face turned a deep shade of crimson. She was furious not only because a son was brutally extorting his own father, but because Aaron had brazenly attempted to use her courtroom and her signature as a weapon to finalize his crime. She had almost been manipulated into legally authorizing a kidnapping and a massive financial theft. Warren let the video play until the exact moment I picked up the pen with my left hand. He paused the footage again. He pulled a copy of the reverse mortgage application from his briefcase and instructed the judge to look at the signature line. Warren pointed out the deliberate biometric inconsistency and the glaring error in my middle name. He stated that Calvin Thomas was a fictitious entity. He informed the court that Aaron and Monica had submitted this forged document to a federal bank and that the bank had already flagged the transaction for severe fraud. He explained that Aaron's emergency guardianship petition today was nothing more than a desperate, frantic attempt to bypass the bank fraud department and steal the property through a forced judicial sale. The judge slammed her legal pad down onto her desk. The sharp crack echoed through the silent room. She looked directly at Aaron with eyes that promised absolute destruction. She declared loudly that the emergency ex parte guardianship petition was immediately denied with extreme prejudice. She stated that the only person in this courtroom who belonged in a secure facility was sitting at the petitioner table. The legal threat to my freedom was instantly and permanently eradicated. Aaron and Monica had lost their desperate gamble to steal my home, but the trap was not finished yet. Warren closed the video files and left the screens blank. I looked across the room at my son. He thought the loss of the house and the perjury charges were the worst things that could happen to him today. He was about to learn that the absolute worst was yet to come. The judge had just slammed her gavel and denied the emergency petition, but Aaron still did not comprehend the absolute totality of his defeat. He slumped back in his wooden chair, letting out a long, ragged breath. I could see the gears turning in his panicked mind. He thought the worst was over. He thought he had simply lost the house and now he just needed to run from the syndicate. He actually looked toward the back doors of the courtroom, calculating his escape route. He assumed he and Monica could just walk out, get into their brand new luxury cars, and disappear into the city. He was completely wrong. Warren did not close his leather briefcase. He reached into the second compartment and pulled out a thick blue folder, securely bound with heavy legal tape. He placed it deliberately on the polished table right next to the toxicology report. I did not wait for my attorney to speak. I kept my eyes locked on my son and addressed the judge directly. I told Judge Bennett that the forged reverse mortgage and the attempted chemical sedation were born from a very specific and violent desperation. I explained in clear clinical detail that Aaron owed $150,000 to an offshore sports betting syndicate operating through a shell company in Cyprus. I told the court about the aggressive interest rates and the violent collection methods his creditors utilized. Aaron's face drained of whatever color had managed to return. He gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles turning white. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, completely unable to comprehend how his isolated, frail father possessed the intimate details of his secret criminal life. Monica began to breathe in short, shallow gasps, realizing that every single dark corner of their existence was being exposed in a federal building. I continued speaking, my voice steady and commanding. I told Aaron that the syndicate had absolutely no loyalty to him. I explained that violent criminals are inherently lazy and motivated entirely by easy profit. I revealed that exactly 48 hours ago I had instructed my legal team to form an anonymous corporate holding company in the state of Delaware. I told him that I used my own liquid capital to approach his creditors with a buyout offer they could not refuse. I paid a massive premium to purchase the entirety of his toxic debt portfolio. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. You could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock above the judge. Aaron's jaw fell open. He shook his head slowly from side to side, refusing to process the words I was speaking. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the crushing blow. I told him that the terrifying men he thought were hunting him had been bought off days ago. I told him I was the anonymous holding company. I was his primary creditor. I owned his debt. I owned his financial future. I owned him entirely. He let out a weak, pathetic whimper. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He finally understood why the threatening phone calls from Cyprus had suddenly stopped. He had mistaken my silent trap for a miraculous grace period. He had used that quiet window to completely destroy his own credit by financing luxury cars and island vacations. He had financed a massive celebration while standing on a trapdoor I had already unlocked. I turned my attention back to the thick blue folder resting on the table. I instructed Warren to hand the documents to the bailiff. I explained to the court that underground syndicate lending contracts are built with exceptionally aggressive default clauses. If a borrower misses a balloon payment, the creditor is legally entitled to immediately seize any and all liquid assets without a secondary court order. I looked at the courtroom clock. I reminded Aaron that his final balloon payment was due yesterday afternoon at exactly 5 o'clock. He had missed that payment because he was too busy admiring the leather interior of a car he could not afford. I stated for the official record that I was executing the absolute default clause right here and right now. I told him that at this exact second, a team of forensic accountants employed by my holding company was actively draining every single bank account tied to his name and Monica name. Every dollar from her paycheck, every tip he had hidden away, every cent in their joint savings account was being legally seized and transferred into my corporate trust to satisfy the penalty fees of his default. They were officially and completely bankrupt. Monica let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing violently, as the reality of absolute poverty crashed down upon her. But I was not finished. I pointed my finger toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. I told Aaron to think about the brand-new black sports sedan and the white luxury utility vehicle they had illegally parked in the commercial loading zone outside the courthouse. I reminded him that they had used the fraudulent reverse mortgage paperwork to secure those predatory loans. I explained that my holding company had already contacted the secondary auto lenders this morning. We provided them with the undeniable proof of his federal mortgage fraud. Those lenders immediately canceled his financing contracts and demanded their property back. I told Aaron that I had purchased the immediate collection rights to those vehicles for a fraction of their cost. I informed him that 2 heavy-duty tow trucks dispatched by my legal team were currently out in the street hooking up those beautiful new cars. They did not belong to him anymore. They belonged to me. Aaron collapsed forward, hitting his forehead against the heavy wooden table. He did not cry. He just let out a long, hollow moan of absolute defeat. He had walked into this courtroom believing he was a wealthy mastermind, about to steal $500,000 and lock his father in a psychiatric ward. In less than 20 minutes, I had systematically dismantled his entire life. He had no house. He had no cars. He had no bank accounts. He had hundreds of thousands of dollars in secondary debt from his spending spree, and he was sitting in front of a furious judge who held all the evidence of his massive criminal extortion plot. The destruction was total, absolute, and irreversible. The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of my attorney unzipping the final compartment of his briefcase sounded like a heavy canvas sail tearing in the wind. Warren reached inside and pulled out a thick, certified leather folder. It was the exact same folder I had carried up the walkway to my front porch just 1 week ago. He handed it to me and stepped back, resting his hands behind his back. I held the heavy leather in my hands, feeling the physical weight of the paper inside. I did not look at the judge or my attorney. I looked directly across the aisle at the man who used to be my son. Aaron was still slumped over the wooden table, his face pale and slick with a cold, nervous sweat. He looked like a hollow shell of a human being, completely broken by the financial ruin I had just dropped on his head. But I knew I had to deliver the final emotional blow to ensure he would never forget this day for the rest of his miserable life. I walked slowly out from behind the respondent table and approached the center of the room. The judge did not stop me. The bailiff did not step forward to block my path. The entire courtroom was completely captivated by the absolute destruction of a greedy son. I stopped just a few feet away from where Aaron and Monica sat. I placed the heavy leather folder down on the polished wood right in front of his folded, trembling hands. I told him to look at it. He slowly raised his head, his eyes bloodshot and entirely vacant. I told him that exactly 7 days ago I had driven home from my attorney office feeling like the luckiest father in the entire world. I explained that I had parked my old sedan in the driveway and walked up to the front porch holding this exact folder against my chest. I told him that my heart was full of absolute joy because I believed I was bringing him a miracle. I reached out and opened the leather cover exposing the crisp, notarized documents with the heavy gold foil seals. I read the numbers aloud, letting them echo off the high vaulted ceiling of the courtroom. I told him that his late aunt had left an estate worth exactly $5 million entirely to me. I watched Aaron's eyes drop down to the paperwork. I watched him read the bold black ink confirming a sprawling $3 million waterfront estate and a dedicated trust account holding $2 million in completely unencumbered liquid cash. The sheer astronomical size of the numbers seemed to completely break his brain. His mouth opened, but he could not even pull breath into his lungs. Monica stared at the gold seals, her entire body shivering uncontrollably, as if the courtroom temperature had suddenly dropped below freezing. She reached out a shaking hand, wanting to touch the paper, but pulled it back, as if the document was on fire. I kept my voice incredibly soft and steady. I told Aaron that when I walked up to that porch 7 days ago, I had already made my decision. I told him I did not need a lake house or $2 million in cash to live out my final years. I explained that my only thought was to give the entire fortune to him and his wife. I told him I was going to pay off his hidden gambling debts the very next morning, so he would never have to live in fear again. I was going to buy them a beautiful house in the suburbs so they could move out of the guest bedroom and start a real life. I was going to set up an ironclad college fund for the children he always promised me he wanted to have. I told him that I was ready to sign over every single penny of that $5 million inheritance to him with absolutely no strings attached. All he had to do was be a loving son. All he had to do was come to me and ask for my help. But I reminded him of what I heard through the open living room window instead. I told him I heard his wife planning to poison my coffee and lock me in a psychiatric ward. I heard him agreeing to forge my signature and steal the tiny fraction of equity sitting in my modest home. I told him that his profound, suffocating greed had completely blinded him to the unconditional love standing right on his own front porch. He was so incredibly desperate to steal $500,000 that he literally threw away $5 million in pure cash and real estate. He threw away his financial freedom, his family legacy, and the absolute devotion of the only father he had left in this world. Aaron let out a sound that I had never heard a human being make before. It was not a normal cry or a simple sob. It was a guttural, agonizing wail of pure, absolute spiritual destruction. He fell out of his wooden chair and collapsed onto his knees on the hard linoleum floor. He reached out and grabbed the fabric of my trousers, begging me to forgive him, pleading that he did not know and that he could change. He clawed at the floor, weeping with such violent force that his entire body shook. He finally realized the true monumental cost of his betrayal. He had traded an empire of wealth and love for a mountain of debt and a criminal record. I looked down at him without a single ounce of pity. I gently pulled my leg away from his desperate, grasping hands. I told him that the money was entirely secure in an irrevocable trust and that he would never see a single cent of it for as long as he lived. I told him that he had chosen his path the moment he let his wife put those pills into my coffee. I turned my back on him completely and walked away, leaving him kneeling on the floor of the courtroom, surrounded by the absolute ashes of the life he had so foolishly burned to the ground. Judge Bennett did not let the silence linger in the courtroom. She picked up her heavy wooden gavel and struck the sounding block 3 separate times. The sharp cracks echoed like thunder across the high vaulted ceiling. She looked directly at the armed bailiffs standing by the courtroom doors and gave a firm, definitive nod. She announced that based on the irrefutable video and physical evidence presented today, she was ordering the immediate detainment of both petitioners. She listed the charges aloud, ensuring they were permanently recorded in the official court transcript. Felony perjury, conspiracy to commit federal bank fraud, attempted extortion, and severe elder abuse. She looked down at Aaron and told him that he had brazenly attempted to use her judicial authority to execute a horrific crime against his own flesh and blood. She promised him that he would be facing the absolute maximum penalties allowed by state and federal law. Two heavy-set bailiffs walked briskly down the center aisle. They did not ask politely. They grabbed Aaron by his shoulders and hauled him roughly up from his knees. Monica tried to scramble toward the gallery, but a third officer intercepted her, grabbing her arms and spinning her around. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around their wrists was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. It was the sound of absolute, undeniable justice. Aaron twisted his neck to look back at me one last time as the officers began to march them toward the secure holding cells at the back of the courtroom. His eyes were wide and begging for a final shred of mercy. I gave him nothing. I stood perfectly still, watching the heavy metal doors swing shut behind them. My house was empty. My life was finally my own again. I turned to my attorney, Warren, and extended my right hand. We shook firmly, sharing a silent acknowledgement of a flawless operation completely executed. I did not need to gather any belongings, because I had walked into that building with nothing but the clothes on my back and the absolute truth. I turned and walked slowly down the center aisle. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the family court division and stepped out into the main lobby. I walked through the security checkpoint and pushed through the revolving glass doors of the courthouse. The late afternoon sun hit my face and the crisp autumn air filled my lungs. I took a deep, slow breath, feeling a massive, suffocating weight lift completely off my chest. I was no longer a prisoner. Warren pulled his quiet luxury sedan up to the curb. I opened the passenger door and slid into the comfortable leather seat. We did not drive back to the suburban neighborhood I had lived in for 40 years. My legal team was already handling the sale of that house and the liquidation of its remaining contents. We drove straight out of the city, leaving the concrete buildings and the heavy traffic far behind us. An hour later, Warren turned down a long, winding gravel driveway surrounded by tall, ancient pine trees. The trees parted to reveal the sprawling, beautiful lake house my sister had left me. The water was perfectly calm, reflecting the brilliant orange and purple colors of the setting sun. I stepped out of the car and walked alone down to the wooden dock. I listened to the gentle sound of the water lapping against the shore. I had lost a son to his own suffocating greed, but I had protected my dignity and my future. The storm was completely over, and I had finally found absolute undisturbed peace. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that blood relation does not automatically guarantee loyalty or love. True family is built entirely on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine care, never on entitlement or manipulation. When greed completely consumes a person, it blinds them to everything else, turning the very people who love them into mere resources to be drained. I realized that setting absolute boundaries, even with the children we raised, is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary mechanism for survival. Sometimes the most profound act of self-love is having the courage to walk away from toxic blood ties and find peace on your own terms. If you believe that true justice always catches up with the greedy, please share your thoughts in the comments, hit the like button, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of survival and resilience.